education, chiefly catechetical, but education, on all confessional sides of the Reformation. Churches devoted themselves to educating their people, in many cases for the first time. They produced catechisms, dueling catechisms throughout Europe. They understood that the first mission land was one's own family, one's own city, one's own country. And reform on all sides of the Reformation begins with clergy and moves to laity. And so the Roman Catechism, 1566, was first prepared for pastors. But over some 3 centuries, it was translated into vernacular languages and adapted to the institutions of Christian formation at different levels. Some great people had a hand in that one, St. Charles Borromeo. And it taught that the primary duty of Christian parents is not making money for their children or putting them into important social positions, but training them to be domestics of God in glory. Marriage was on the front lines of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. Number one, because it's one of the 7 sacraments that was denied by most Protestants. So there had to be extensive catechetical treatment of that. But also because cases and questions over matrimony go to ecclesiastical rather than civil courts. And it was not just Protestants who disagreed with that. Most of the Catholic princes disagreed with that too. So the primary disciplinary canon of the Council of Trent on marriage, that's called Temezi, was never enforced in France. But Trent, I say, had a long shelf life. It goes all the way to the time of Leo XIII, who issues an encyclical called Arcanum Divinae, 1880, 300 years after Trent, the first magisterial teaching since Trent on marriage, which is still very Tridentine. Then Pius XI issues an encyclical on marriage, Casti Connubii, to mark the 50th anniversary of Arcanum, in between which was the first Code of Canon Law in 1917. Really, from the time of the Council of Trent, 1563, the Catechism 3 years after that, all the way to 1930, there are 3 documents, magisterial. And everything you need to know about marriage and family are in these 3 documents. I'm going to highlight a couple of things about that era, the reception of Trent, as late as the 19th and 20th century. Beginning with Trent and its catechism, and then the teachings of Pope Leo and then Pius XI, the good of procreation is invariably stated with a very explicit qualification that for Christians, the sacrament enlarges the telos of procreation from family and ordinary domestic order to the education of children as a people in the cult of the true God. I'm quoting Trent on that. In Arcanum, Leo says, by the command of Christ, it not only looks to the propagation of the human race, but to the bringing forth of children for the church, fellow citizens and saints, and the domestics of God, unquote. Pius XI repeats the obligation of the baptized to educate their children in the virtue of religion. Point number 1, the family starts being treated in the Tridentine era in terms of the munus of married people to educate their children chiefly as domestics of God. It's also in the Tridentine documents, which I'm taking all the way through Leo and Pius, a twofold explication of Genesis. People think that John Paul II is the one that came up with this, but I guarantee you it's in Trent. In Genesis, the hexameron, the 6 days of creation, is completed not by the creation of a new substance, but by the union of man and woman. And following the teaching of Jesus on the indissolubility of marriage in Matthew 19, they splice together Genesis 1 and 2 because it gives two different portals into what marriage is. In Genesis 1, what is emphasized is the excellence of the image bearers, made into the image and likeness of God. And because of this excellence, they go on to complete creation by their own fertility and education. Whereas Genesis 2 emphasizes the incompletion of human beings who, by the one flesh unity, complete one another and perfect one another in their bond. Both of these are true. One emphasizes completion of creation because of the excellence. The other emphasizes our incompleteness and need for the bond, this bond of the unakero. This is emphasized throughout the era, and questions of the family arise under both aspects. Clearly under the first aspect of Genesis 1, which is to be fruitful and multiply. But also under Genesis 2, because the unity of the family is directly follows from the bond of one flesh, not just biologically, but socially and familially. One thing changed along the way, though, these standard teachings, which I'm only summarizing, is what Leo XIII called in his encyclical on the family the Great Conflagration, the French Revolution. And the French Revolution managed to turn an ancient Catholic culture of vows upside down in the space of about 3 years. For example, the prohibition of monastic vows and the requiring of a clerical oath to the civil constitution of the church, 1790. Marriage was made only a civil contract, and celibacy for the secular clergy was relaxed, 1791. Decrees regulating divorce and abolishing the monarchy in 1792, thus spelling the demise of the two great vows of the laity in Christendom, the vow of the king and the indissoluble bond of Christian married people. During this time, the theme of education was very much deepened. And let me say this, we moved from an era of catechizing to schools. And catechizing and schools are really two different things. Well, let me get to that in a second. Under social doctrine, which begins to crystallize during Leo XIII's pontificate, 1878 to 1903, popes discussed the family in the context of three great or necessary societies. Societies that are necessary for human perfection and happiness. Marriage, hyphen family, because they're two different societies. Church, and polity. Marriage is put first because while people are not born into marriage, matrimony is the principle and the foundation of the domestic society. So to paraphrase and slightly change Aristotle's idea, human persons are matrimonial, familial, political, and ecclesial animals. And the institutions in which these perfections and excellences are brought forth, marriage, family, polity, and church. A lot of effort had to be spent on defending marriage and family. Why? What had changed since the Reformation era? Well, since the French Revolution, enlightened reform, country after country, changed matrimonial and family law. civil marriage and divorce, and then the rise of totalitarian states, the fascists and the communists. But above all, it was schools. And the church had to argue ever more insistently that the obligation of parents in procreating must be ordered to the whole good of the child. A lot of this had to do with the school question, but it also had to do with the problem of nationalism. It was not enough to say merely that married people procreate, lest the state claim that the matrimonial duty having been accomplished, the children be handed over to the civil community. They had to at once deepen the understanding of the matrimonial bond and to deepen the understanding of the obligation and rights that bond represents with regard to education of children. They had to, above all, make sure that Catholics and the secular rulers understood that marriage is not just a platform for procreation. Mussolini would have agreed with that right away. So would the Nazis. So would many of the liberals. It's a platform for procreation. All the rest belongs to culture and the state. So it was Pius XI, in his encyclical on marriage, Casti Connubii, who had the immortal line, "The family is more sacred than the state." Why? Because the family aims at the whole good of the child, which includes the child's supernatural destiny. So, for the most part, magisterial documents that touch on the family are focused around two institutions: the relation of domestic society to the rights and obligations of parents. Parents are always discussed first. And number two, the relation of domestic society to parochial and public schools, because we now have on the scene a new institution that didn't exist in the 16th century. Schools. Everyone is required to go to schools. What did the church get right back then, over these 350 years that I'm skipping over very quickly? Number one, they really did properly put that procreation requires education, and that for the baptized, education is an ecclesial function of training domestics of God. Number two, they understood that the issue of schools is not just worldly success. It's the formation of the entire good of the child, moral and spiritual and intellectual. Number three, the 19th and 20th century were the great era of devotions. If you want to know of the two most important things that affected the Catholic family, number one, schools. Number two, devotions. Since the late 18th century, the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and then many different Marian devotions that arise in the 19th and 20th century, children were brought into prayer. Anyone who grew up in Catholic world before 1965 knows this. Now, Leo XIII himself approved the decrees of the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, 1884, launched the largest parochial school system in the history of the Catholic Church. In fact, it was in 1917 that the Church formally adopted the canonical practice of requiring non-Catholic spouses to sign agreements. Not to be a good wife, but agreements for the education of the child. And the Code of Canon Law of 1917 goes further than that. It says, and the pastor must be morally certain that she or he will perform in that duty. The Catholic Church was absolutely preoccupied with the school issue for a lot of different reasons, but it wasn't just the Catholic school. Everyone was immersed and enveloped in formal education. Arguably, no institution has more deeply affected family life in modern times, and not just for Catholics. So in the Catholic world, the rise of formal education left a very deep mark on how we understand the family, and by the way, if I may say, a very deep mark upon what family means in religious life. Formal education. Nothing is the same after everyone gets schooled. We're not talking about 13th century schools here. And Americans did push ahead, created the largest parochial school system in the history of the Catholic Church. Rather quickly, too, in the course of about 50 years. 3,500 Catholic schools in the United States, reaching all age groups in 1900. By 1920, 6,500, serving 1.7 million elementary-age students. Right into our own time, family issues have to do with parental obligations to religiously educate their children and the protection of parental and ecclesial rights having to do with schools. Now, there were seeds that were sown for a doctrine of the family as an ecclesiola, a little church. In fact, you find these seeds all over the place in Trent, in the Roman Catechism, and in the two great encyclicals of Leo and Pius. Families have said, your obligation is not to send your child to Yale. Your obligation is to form your child to be the domestic of God. And that is the beginning of a kind of an ecclesial role. And it's not just the pastor's obligation. By the way, the big difference between Trent and later, the Roman Catechism is written ad parochios. It tells the pastor what to say to the lay people. By the time I was growing up, those Tridentine catechisms, like Baltimore Catechism, they could be recited at home. Parents could hear your homework in recitation of answers to the so-called Baltimore Catechism. Another interesting thing happens is that these two facets of Genesis, two facets of marriage, are completeness and excellence in being able to be fruitful and multiply and complete God's own creation, and our neediness for this deep and absolutely sui generis bond, conjugal bond. For the first time that I know of, is applied to the family by John Paul II. That the family now can be spoken of analogically as both the excellence of human intelligence, fertility, intelligence, and the change of society for the better, and as bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, in ways that Father Anselm was suggesting. It's John Paul II who first says that in his letter to families in 1994. I know of no previous use of the splicing together of Genesis 1 and 2. And here, for the first time, I'm almost done. For the first time that I know of in a magisterial document, Gratissimum Sane, we find the term bonum familiae. So we have the term bonum conjugum, the conjugal good. That's now used standardly since Gaudium et Spes through the 1983 Code of Canon Law. By the way, it's already there in Leo and in Pius, just not quite in those two words together. So John Paul II puts on the table, I think for the first time, bonum familiae, bonum conjugum, as though these two realities have to be rethought much more deeply as companionate goods. So, to complete, 500 years, we spent a lot of time on parents, a lot of time on religious education, and in this country, a lot of time and money on schools, and the religious orders and congregations that staff them in loco parentis. lots of important seeds were sown for a full theology of the family itself. It would take to Vatican II and John Paul II for these seeds to start to be realized. So I say, we're beginning to get family on the right track. In the old days, they had it on the right track without a lot of teaching about it, probably. They just did it. They had devotions, they had schools, and they did it. And here I have to register my agreement with Father Sweeney that the Synod relatio is extremely weak. And there's all kinds of reasons why it is. It's one thing to have 5,100 bishops, but even 250 are probably, 250 for only 3 weeks is not enough to put together a well-considered document. I find the relatio very flat and consisting of quotations from other popes strung together like proof texts without even knowing what the argument is that they're supposed to be the proof texts of. I think they were playing very defensively. And so there's a lot of work to be done, bringing family into its own. That's not just a tailpiece of parental rights or the school issue or catechism. There's more to it than that. But to integrate what could be called the theological, the pastoral, and the canonical parts of this, we're far from there, and I'll just leave you with one very sobering fact. The new Code of Canon Law, 1983, mentions familia in the substantive only 3 times. Only 3 times. So here we have the gallons of ink that JP2 is spilling, the fantastic reinterpretations of Genesis, the good of the family, good of the conjugal order, all the stuff in Gaudium et Spes on this, letter to families, beautiful petitions to international organizations about the whole good of the child, and so on and so forth. The canonists have only produced 3 passing references to the word family in the substantive. Whoa. I mean, because, like it or not, we are a church that's ruled by law. And so when our law only gives passing references, the job of getting the ecclesial status of the family moved along to the next step, still to be done. Sorry by doing 500 years like that. I mean, it's sort of like a PBS show. Speed it up 4 times or something. Okay, thank you.